Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com. In this video I'm going to be doing something that's pretty unique to the channel, nothing I've ever seen on any other channel, and something that's pretty unique in the career of a mix engineer in general, and that is going to be stem mixing. Stem mixing means that the producer and maybe the producer's engineer came up with a sound for their record that they're happy with, committed stems like all the drums, all the instruments, all the vocals, etc., and then sent it to me to do just the finishing touches, just to polish things up a little bit. Now, this is pretty atypical in terms of the normal mix process, but it does happen particularly in EDM genres. This is no exception to that. This is a David Guetta remix of an Akon record that I recorded and mixed. So the way this process worked is I did the recording, and then I did the initial mix of the original track. I committed my stems, sent them over to Guetta. Guetta did his remix. His engineer Timothy did a mix of that. They committed the stems, and then they sent the stems back to me. So a very atypical process, but you know, as long as the end result is something great, it doesn't really matter what the process is. But the question is, what do we do with stem mixing when the record's essentially already been mixed? How do we approach that, and what can we learn from it? Well, let's take a listen to this record. Let's figure out what the reference is giving us, and then decide if there even is anything to improve, because that's really the big question. What needs to change, if anything at all?
Listen, we might learn something. Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor. Ish the Kano, remix with Akon. You're one run, where this man come from? Bojin, Senegal Bojin, for Jamaican City Bojin.
So right off the bat, I would say that if this went to mastering like this, I think that I would be happy. I would be happy to have my name on it. I think that everybody else would be happy as well. So in general, we're really not looking to change a lot. So whenever I'm assessing something, I'm trying to look at the big picture. I'm trying to look at all of the things that I like as well as the things that I dislike. I think sometimes as engineers, we forget to look for the things that are working, and in doing so, we sometimes neglect what really makes the record special. So the first thing I'm asking myself is, what's really working in this reference? And for me, I really like the bounce of it. There's a sort of chewiness to the kick and low end. There's a beefiness to it that I like, but at the same time, I'm really picking up the swing on those hi-hats. So I really like the groove of it. I want to make sure that I'm preserving that. I also like just generally the arrangement. Like, I like the way that the sounds kind of fold together in like both a hi-fi and lo-fi kind of way. Like, there's a lot of like interesting textures and tones that are really not perfect but are really fun to listen to. And so I want to make sure that I'm preserving or enhancing those things as well. Now, what do I feel can be stronger? Let's listen one more time.
Listen, we might learn something. Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor. Ish the Kano, remix with Akon.
There's a couple of little tiny things that I think could be improved ever so slightly. The first is that transition point with that drum fill could be a lot more surprising. It could be a little bit more over the top. I like my transitions to be really, really spicy, because that's what wakes the listener up. It gets them back into the moment and keeps the groove really powering forward. So I think the transition could be a little bit stronger. The low end feels a little bit kind of like over bloated, like it feels a little too dense, and so I kind of want to open up the low end a little bit, but I have to be really careful because I think that chewiness that I liked is very much connected to that kind of bloatedness that I don't like. So I have to be really, really meticulous about the low end. And then also, I think that the record does feel a little bit small in terms of the top to bottom kind of spread of it. Like, it's very rounded, which I do like, but it kind of feels a little bit tiny in the speakers. Not tiny, just a little bit tiny. So those are the things that I can improve. Now, here's what I came up with.
Listen, we might learn something. Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor. Ish the Kano, remix with Akon. You're one run, where this man come from? Bojin, Senegal Bojin.
So one more time, going back to the reference.
Listen, we we might learn something. Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor.
And mine.
Listen, we might learn something. Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor. Ish the Kano, remix with Akon.
So a little less round, a little bit bigger in the speakers, a little bit more open in the low end, a little less weighty though at the same time. So there's a lot of trade-offs going on. And ultimately it's hard to say if one is entirely better than the other. I don't think that that's really possible. Overall, I do prefer mine, but I think that if somebody were to prefer the reference, I would understand. It really just depends on what we're really listening for. So now I want to go through some of the things that are happening in this version of the mix that kind of separate it from the original. So basically the way this is sent is we have most of the instruments from the original version on a 2-track, and that 2-track comes down to this here. And if I were to take off my effects, it originally sounded like this. So there's a certain pump to it, like a very kind of traditional EDM sort of pump, maybe like a little bit gentler than some of the like heavier bass kind of music, but like, you know, not atypical of like an old school house kind of a thing, which I think works really well for this record. The bass is very, very overwhelming in this, which is not a bad thing because the instruments are being supplemented with this guitar. So we don't really miss them as much, and that kind of grunge in the bass really mixes well with that particular guitar. So I like the vision here. I think it's really, really cool. But I do feel like we can maybe open up the low end just a little bit more. The only thing is that the low end is baked into all of those guitars. So the first thing that I'm doing is I'm using a crossover to separate the lows and the highs. So everything under 570 Hertz is coming out of my main channel, and then everything above 570 Hertz is actually going to a separate channel. So if I just mute the separate channel, I get the bass pretty isolated. Now, in terms of the tone, Guetta did something. It's some kind of a distortion that was not there before that I really, really, really like. I like the way it all sounds, so I'm not really going to try and change the sonics of it much. All I'm doing is adding a little bit more of that pump to it, and that's it. And that's just to open up the low end a little bit more and let it breathe. So it's a game of give and take here for sure. I'm really only doing a subtle amount of it. And then on my receive channel, which is everything above 570 Hertz, there's a lot of bass buildup in general, so I'm using a linear phase EQ to shelve off some of the excess bass, so about 4 dB of bass coming down. This is what the send channel sounds like originally. And you can hear that there's still a lot of bass getting caught in that channel, so I'm just opening things up a little. And that's going to clean up my low end pretty well. The last little thing that I'm doing is ever so slightly just pulling down the tiniest bit of 500 Hertz, and that's just to make it so that the vocals are a little bit clearer. So if I take those effects off, versus on. So it's just a little bit smaller. Then bringing in the guitar, which originally sounded like this. And I want to bring that guitar out a little bit. I think that that's part of what makes this remix more remixy. So I'm taking out some of those woofier tones around 400 Hertz and also a little bit of resonance around 550. And we have a much more open sound, and it's a little bit more rock edgy, so to speak. And that, I would say, is the biggest change that I'm making, is just the way those instruments are sitting. Basically, it's the difference between something that's really dense versus something that breathes a little more. And again, it's sort of give and take. Is it entirely better? I don't think so. It depends on how you're listening, and ultimately it's going to be up to the producer and the artist to decide that. The drums, I'm doing nothing. I think that the drums sound perfect. They're spot on, so nothing to do. Keeping it moving. Then we get down to the fill. And the fill, I think, is probably the biggest change that I'm going to make in terms of just the dynamics, and that's giving a little bit of bite to the drum fill, because originally it sounds like this, which is really nice sounding, but maybe a little bit too sampled off of the cassette sounding. So I'm just giving it a little bit less of the lows, or rather the low mids, bumping up the very bass of it, bumping up some of the treble of it, raising the level overall. Right, so we get that nice, good, aggressive bite off of the snare, because I really want to wake people up in that moment. And then similarly, doing a tilt shelf, which is a very underrated tool on the organ to kind of take out some of the lows and add some of the color of the highs. So without it, it sounds like this, which is nice, but I kind of want that movement of the back and forth to be a little bit more localizable. And once I've done that, we get that really, really strong transition sound, and it wakes us all up.
If we just listen, we might learn something. Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor.
Alright, so all the crashes and effects, no changes at all. Just finding the right level for them, which is almost how they came in exactly. Or maybe even how they came in exactly. So bam, there's that, nothing crazy there. And then we get down to the vocals. So the vocals, again, they were already treated when I sent them, and I think that Guetta maybe did like a little bit with the vocals, but actually it sounds pretty darn similar to how I sent it, except for the background vocals. The background vocals, I don't know what he did. I could take a potshot guess, but I'll play it for you. And what I think is happening there is there sounds like there's some kind of an exciter, and then it's feeding a reverb that's very, very heavy on early reflections, but not like a super pristine reverb unit. I would say it might even be like the stock Ableton reverb, but maybe something that's kind of AMS RMX 16 sounding. Like it's not a very polished reverb. It's not like a Bricasti. And it's creating this very comb filtery sound with this very like icy tail. Like it almost sounds like an EQ into the ambient setting on an RMX 16, then followed by like a Yamaha Rev 5 or Rev 7 for the tail. But I'm pretty sure it's being done in one unit of some sort, and it's not that composite of two units. But it's a very over-the-top sound that sounds like really off on its own, and then when you hear it in the mix, it sounds super cool. Yeah, there's like tons of resonances and like a comb filtery kind of sound. And then there's this second bus underneath it that feels like it's the same effect, but just like 100% of it on the return. So it's like it kind of allows for some kind of a blend. It's like a room return, but then with like a really long tail afterwards or something like that. So the two kind of come together. And it's just this totally crazy sound. It almost starts to become more like a guitar than a vocal, which I think is super cool. And then when we hear it in the mix,
And not each other. Fight the oppressor. Be the successor.
and I just love it. There's nothing to do with it except for just acknowledge how cool it is and keep it moving. So, there it is. But I think that it's some kind of a reverb unit with a lot of space between the early reflections and the tail, a very clean, highly diffuse tail, a very low diffusion and very heavily weighted early reflection with a lot of treble in it. And then it's all being fed from an exciter or feeding into an exciter. That's my feeling in terms of how to remake that sound, but I don't know exactly how it's done without actually being in the studio. Okay, Khan's vocal, pretty much the way that I sent it. The remix here is a little bit brighter, so I'm adding a little bit of weight to the vocal, but I'm also adding a little bit of treble as well, just to kind of keep up with the brightness of things. But otherwise, this is basically how I sent it, I believe.
Bojin, Senegal Bojin, for Jamaican City Bojin.
And there's a number of things that are cool about this vocal. It's a JZ V67, which was I used that right here in my living room to record Khan. And then there's some really, really heavy over-the-top compression at the end of the chain. That's really what's creating that squeeze. And then the reverb is, I believe, Valhalla Supermassive, and it's got LFO tool on it, so there's a pumping to the reverb, and the delays are being ducked, so there's a lot of like interchange between the ambiances.
Bojin, Senegal Bojin, for Jamaican City Bojin.
Right, like in between the vocal phrase, you hear that ping-ponging delay come up.
Senegal Bojin, for Jamaican.
Right, but it's there the whole time, and then also there's sort of this like sense of the reverb kind of moving to the tempo of the track.
Bojin, Senegal Bojin.
And that's kind of helped along with the delay. So that's what's going on there. Now I'm pointing that out because I then have this vocal here that was flown in as a punch just for the remix.
Shout out Africa, and David Guetta.
Now that sounds nothing like a JZ V67, so matching it was a little tricky. I went back to the original settings that I used, but then I had to keep tweaking it to sort of make it match. There's like a low-mid saturation in the JZ V67 that just makes everything really heavy and glued sounding, and that's really hard to replicate in post. So I did my best, and ultimately I ended up settling on this.
For Jamaican City Bojin, shout out Africa, and David Guetta, East Africa, Addis Ababa.
And if you know to notice it, you know that it doesn't quite sound the same. But if you're not really paying attention to it on that level, maybe you feel a slight shift, but ultimately it feels pretty similar. Basically what I'm doing is I'm using lo-fi to kind of add a little bit of crust, to get a little bit of tone. I'm using my ambient processing that I was using as an insert going into compression, and just modifying the settings to make sure that it feels as close to what the original acapella felt like. But I mean, there's a lot of changes here. Like I have to watch my low mids very carefully because there's a lot of low mid in this capture, but it's not a saturated low mid. So it's like if I take out too much, it ends up sounding a little too clean and too thin compared to the way the original vocal sounded. But let's hear it in solo. I think it'll be more apparent where the differences are.
For Jamaican City Bojin, shout out Africa, and David Guetta, East Africa, Addis Ababa.
I think one thing that could change actually is I could just change the depth and timing on the OTT, and that actually might help a little bit.
Shout out Africa, and
yeah. And then of course using that same reverb chain with Supermassive and LFO tool to bring up the reverb.
Shout out Africa, and David Guetta, East Africa, Addis Ababa.
So still noticeable, but at least reasonably similar. And then there are some added ad-libs, or added harmonies actually.
Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor.
So my goal with this is to blend it in with the main vocal.
Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor.
So to do that, I'm first compressing everything so that it all kind of sits to like in a consistent place. Right now it's a little bit up and down.
Let's fight together.
Right, you hear the gather bumps up. So I'm using a compressor to even that all out.
Let's fight together and not each other.
Okay, so now everything's sitting on the same plane, and then outside of that, it's really just some very simple EQ to get it to blend. The only thing that's really making this vocal kind of a little weird sounding is that buildup of low mid that's around like 600 hertz. So without.
Let's fight together and not each other.
With.
Let's fight together and not each other.
And so that's going to blend a lot better. And when we play the two together, it sounds like this.
Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor.
And they actually sit together really well. I think the difference in microphones actually kind of works nice for the layering because you get this clean harmony layer that just feels very transparent on top of this sort of more saturated fundamental layer. So it's actually kind of a cool blend, and kind of like, you know, next time I'm doing harmony stacks, I might even consider swapping out a mic to something that's like a little bit more pristine to create that sort of effect. It's kind of neat. And then I'm picking reverbs and delays that work with it. So I'm using the Relab. I wanted something kind of more colorful because the capture is cleaner, so a more colorful reverb is nice. It's a variation on one of my presets. It's a very highly modulated preset. The spin and wander are way, way up, so that creates a very chorusy sound. And then LFO tool to give it the pumping reverb effect. And then also repeater for delays, and then that's set up to duck so that while the vocal is in, they're stuffed down, but between the phrases they come up, and that's what the original vocal is doing as well, so it's preserving that movement, and once it all comes together, we get this.
Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor.
And that's smooth as silk. I love the way that that sounds. So nice little blend there. Okay, then everything comes down to the mix bus. So the mix bus, let's pull this way up here so that it's nice and visible here. The mix bus is really tricky because there's a lot of compression already in the record, the way that it was already set up. So any further kind of compression or EQ is going to get magnified. So very, very little things make a big difference. This is without anything except for this limiter that's keeping the level in check.
Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor. Ish the Kano, remix with Akon.
So all in all, not bad. It feels like it's a little bit sloppy, that's all. It feels like there's a few tones that are kind of aberrant. It doesn't feel completely glued together. So I'm using actually sort of a different compressor than I normally use, but this was a recommendation from Guetta's engineer Timothy when I was talking about getting the bounce of things right, and he really recommended this one. It's sort of a grainier, kind of old school compressor, but it has a really nice feel to it. So it was interesting kind of messing around with this, but it's basically an SSL emulation. So I'll give you a quick before and after on that.
Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor. Ish the Kano, remix with Akon. You're one wrong, where this man come from? Bojin, Senegal, Bojin.
So the way I have it set 4:1, which is not just a ratio control, but it's also a knee control. And different things happen to the swing when you set it 2:1, 4:1, and 10:1. It's not just about how much gain reduction you're doing. It's really about how it grabs. And 10:1 actually sounds really nice on this record too. I've gone between 10:1 and 4:1 several times.
Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor. Ish the Kano, remix with Akon.
So that to me sounds like a party. That sounds like a party in a club, and I love that sound. If I change it to 4:1, we get something slightly different.
Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor. Ish the Kano, remix with.
At 4:1, everything glues together a little bit more. The bounce of it actually weights more toward the sustain than the attack a little bit, so we're hearing that whoop whoop a little bit more. And there's a spongier quality to everything, which I think is more similar to the reference. And so for those reasons, I settled on 4:1, but I like 10 to 1 as well, and I think left to my own devices without a reference, I might have just stayed at 10 to 1 because that's originally what I guessed I was going to like, and I immediately liked it. So there is something to that. Attack time is 10 to 1. It's enough to catch the kick drum, but not enough to actually squash the kick drum. But I'm reacting to the kick drum, so I'm keeping the sidechain off. A lot of the times when I'm doing 2-bus compression, I'm putting in the sidechain to preserve the kick. In this particular case, I'm using this as glue and also for movement, and I need the kick to tell the compressor what to do. So if I sidechain the kick out, I'm not going to be able to get that movement to feel right. And then lastly, the release is a density control. If I switch this over to I'll exaggerate it, I'll go to 0.6 seconds, you'll hear that the whole record, while it swings in a really cool way, sounds kind of thin.
Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor.
Whereas if I go to 0.1, it sounds the fullest, but it also feels like it lacks a little bit of the swing that I'm looking for.
Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor.
So I'm gaining loudness and perceived loudness, but I'm losing a little bit of the swing. And so I found that 0.2 actually felt the best overall. And that's where we get like this really nice little compromise.
Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor.
And then lastly, just a very, very tiny bit of 2-bus EQ. The 400 hertz, a little tiny 400 hertz cut just to kind of open things ever so slightly. Now again, the reference was pretty dense, so I'm really only doing like half a dB of attenuation, maybe not even at 400 hertz. And then this differentiates from the reference a little bit, but I wanted to give a little bit more spark to the hats because that's really carrying the inside groove. So I'm adding like not even a full dB at 7.6K, so almost 8K, just to get the hi-hats to step up a little bit.
Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor. It's the Kano remix with Akon. You're one wrong, where this man come from?
And I'm not even convinced that even that little 400 hertz cut is actually necessary, so I'm actually going to take it out and play it again.
Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor. It's the Kano remix with Akon. Yo.
Ooh, it's like an argument between openness and fullness that's like, and it's so subtle. I think I'm gonna leave it in. That's my instinct. That's what I'm gonna go with, but it's pretty tight. And this limiter is really only just so that I can measure up next to the reference. So I've got the output attenuated by minus 2.5. It says minus 2.4, but it's actually minus 12.5. And then I'm doing 12.2 dB of gain. So it's actually not gaining as much as it's attenuating. And that's what's allowing me to compare the reference. The reference is already limited, but then taken down 12.5 dB, so I know that we're level matched if I'm playing the reference.
Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor.
So that was the reference. Here's my mix.
Let's fight together and not each other. Fight the oppressor, be the successor. It's the Kano.
And I feel that I was able to get everything that I like from the reference, while at the same time changing the things that I didn't like and finding that sweet spot of compromise where I could create a bigger sounding record that still had the same feel and the same energy and the same excitement. Alright guys, if you dig this video, hit that like button. If you want to catch more videos like this, hit subscribe with the bell notification so you get notified. And lastly, you know what we say here at Weiss Advice, we are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.